of the Center for New Words and the board and staff of the Center for New Words. It's my great pleasure and honor to welcome you here tonight to hear from Dr. Mary Frances Berry. The Center for New Words, for those of you who aren't familiar, is an organization dedicated to creating spaces and places where women's words matter. We are a nonprofit center which grew out of a feminist bookstore, which was around in the Cambridge area for 27 years, New Words Bookstore. And now we present all manner of programs and workshops and conferences trying to sort of wedge open the door, which seems to try to be shut against women's voices, especially progressive women's voices in this culture. So we offer great author events like the one that you're out tonight. We offer open mics. We have a conference every year on women action in the media. We have book groups and discussion groups and workshops, all manner of stuff. And just to give you a little sample, I'd like to tell you about what's coming up. Tomorrow night, actually, we're hosting Jill Soloway, who is the just former head writer of 6 Feet Under, and for her new book, which is called Tiny Ladies in Shiny Pants, which is kind of a hysterical feminist manifesta. Which you really have to hear to believe. It's going to be really fabulous. And then the next night, Friday, at the Center, which is in Inman Square, we are hosting our monthly open mic, which is called New Voices, and we'll be featuring the winners of our 2005 poetry contest. And next week, at 5:30 on CCTV, Cambridge Community Television, we're debuting a brand new television program called New Words Live, which will be featuring a talented local woman writer every month, the third Wednesday of the month. And if you are a talented local women writer, we're still looking for women. We have September and October booked. We're still looking for women right now for November and December. So the guidelines are on our website, which is at centerfornewwords.org. If you're interested in more information about us and what we do and what's coming up, do be sure to pick up a purple brochure. This has all of our fall programs in it. And sign up on our email list so we can keep in touch with you. You get a weekly announcement about what's coming up, special events, things that we plan that we didn't get to print here, contests, all kinds of things. And we never give your information away, and we don't bombard your email list. How many of you here are on the list? Yeah. How many of you like it? We try to make it a really likable email list because we know what it's like to get too much email. We try to make it fun to read. I also have a couple housekeeping announcements. One is if you have anything on your person that may beep or ping spontaneously, we would so appreciate it if you would turn it off. Thank you. And also, you'll notice the lovely woman with the camera in our midst. That's Heather. She's here from WGBH. We have a partnership with WGBH through their Forum network where they tape some of our programs, and actually they have a similar relationship with the Museum of Afro-American History, who's co-hosting this event with us, and they're going to make this event available through web streaming and downloading so that people who couldn't be here tonight but who have web access will be able to hear Dr. Berry's comments that way, which is to say that if you do speak during the question and answer program, part of the program, you will be recorded. And certainly if you have questions you'd like to ask off record, I'm sure Dr. Berry will be happy to talk to you about them after the formal program has ended. With that, it's my distinct honor, and I want to say a really heartfelt thank you to the Museum of Afro-American History and to Tracy Gibbs, whom I worked with, for partnering with us in producing this event. It's been such a lovely time working together, and it was so wonderful for them to open the museum, for the reception that some of us were just at, and to help us get access, all of us get access to this lovely space we're in now. And it's just been a really lovely beginning of a partnership, and I've really appreciated it. So thank you. And in fact, I'm about to invite up Beverly Morgan Welch, who's the executive director of the Museum of Afro-American History, who will tell you a bit about the museum and also have the honor of introducing Dr. Berry.
Good evening. What a pleasure. It's nice to partner with organizations who know how to be nice and do meaningful things. So thank you very, very, very much. The Museum of Afro-American History, for those of you who are not aware, has two historic sites here in Boston and two on Nantucket. For some of you, you were just at the museum's Abiel Smith School, and next door is the African Meeting House built in 1806. That meeting house is closed and undergoing restoration right now, and next year on December 6th, we're going to celebrate its bicentennial. It's the oldest African meeting house in this nation, the oldest extant African American church building built by free African Americans. It's a wonderful, wonderful historical space. But in the meantime, when we have events like this, we come to Old West. And one of the reasons we come to Old West is because they built this sanctuary also in 1806. And the African Meeting House indeed bought some of the floorboards and other materials from the first Old West, and those are part of the African Meeting House. We think we discovered, recycling. They were doing it long before us, just as reparations were long before the wonderful Charles Ogletree and others began talking about it again. It is my distinct pleasure to get the opportunity to introduce Mary Frances Berry. I do that looking at the history that the museum presents in so very many ways, and realizing that, of course, we talk about our ancestors, and we often talk about those of us who are present here today are our ancestors. Well, no one better speaks to that than Mary Frances Berry. I know for many of us she is an absolute one at the top of the list, is one of our heroines and one of the sheroes of this country, who has exemplified in only the best of ways those who struggled in a singular cause very often, those who saw that just because no one else was willing to do it didn't mean they weren't supposed to step forward. In fact, that meant they were supposed to step forward and get it done. Mary Frances Berry was born in Nashville, Tennessee. She received a bachelor's and master's degree at Howard University, a doctorate in history from the University of Michigan, and a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Michigan Law School. Dr. Berry has received many awards, and I will not list them here because I imagine this is the very short list, and it doesn't at all exemplify all the many things that she has done. But she has been chairperson of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission and was that for 11 years. And some of you know of the controversy around that and the way in which she stood up for herself and for us all. Dr. Berry is currently the Geraldine R. Siegel Professor of American Social Thought at the University of Pennsylvania, where she teaches history of American law, and she currently lives in Washington, D.C. She has written this book and reclaimed this history for all of us. We are there in the record. We, people of color, we women, and Dr. Berry is here to share that history with us. Mary Frances Berry.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Let me just say how much I appreciate the Center for New Words and the museum for inviting me, and how lovely it is to be in this wonderful historic church in this historic area. And we, of course, are talking about history, so it all comes together. And to see all of you here. This work that I did on Callie House was a labor of love. It really was a labor of love. I found out about her when I was at a reception in Detroit for the historian John Hope Franklin some years ago. And someone came up to me, a guy, at the reception and started chatting. And he was a retired labor union activist who's now dead. And he said that when he heard I was from Nashville, he said a 90-year-old man who came up from the South to work in the automobile industry once told him that there was a woman who started a movement to get pensions for ex-slaves and that her headquarters was in Nashville. And he asked me did I know anything about it, and I didn't. And so I started to research it, and when I was still just out of graduate school, I did an article in an obscure journal about the trial in which she was involved, because that's all I knew about the trial. And then I left the story and didn't do anything with it for years. And then about 10 years ago, when people started talking about reparations again, I decided to go back and find out what this woman's story was. Like, who was she and what was she doing and who were her people and all the rest of it. And so I went back and started researching her. And what I found is what I tell us in this book. She was a woman who was born into slavery in 1861. Her father, as best I can tell, was one of the blacks who were rounded up by the Union Army. They called the Union Army, the blacks did, the blue men, because they wore blue uniforms, and was put in the military, and he fought in the military. And as far as I can tell, he was killed. And her mother, after that, her mother was a washerwoman, as many women were. They took in washing in those days. And Callie House lived in the household of her sister and her brother-in-law with her mother. And both the sister-in-law and the mother took in washing, and the guy was a laborer, and all the way through high school. And then at some point she married, and her husband was a laborer, and they had 5 children. And her husband died, and she was a widow, of course. And she supported herself and the children by taking in laundry and sewing people's clothes just like her mother had done, and like many women did in that period. And one day she was in church, and they were selling a pamphlet. A guy came through town. This was in Murfreesboro, which is a small town outside Nashville. Came through selling a pamphlet, and it was called A Plea for the Ex-Slaves. And he was a white guy who had this idea that the South, the white people of the South, had not benefited from anything since slavery, and the South was an economic disaster basket case, and that if he could figure out how to get some money into the pockets of the slaves, the ex-slaves, they would spend it on the plantation, and the masters would get it, and they would have money, and that this was an indirect way to get them some money. And in this pamphlet, he said that he had gotten some congressman who he gave some money to introduce a bill in Congress to get some pensions for these slaves. And he said in the pamphlet, all of that sounded interesting to the people who read it. And what they did is they bought the pamphlet, they put their money together to buy it. They couldn't afford to buy all these pamphlets, so they would buy one and everybody would read it. And she read it. And what they didn't like about it, and what she didn't like about it, is he said in there that they were better off when they were slaves because they had food to eat and somewhere to sleep, and the masters were good to them. And now that they weren't slaves anymore, they didn't have anybody to take care of them, but that they ought to join him in trying to get the Congress to give this money. But he said in the pamphlet that the money was going to be spent and given to the white people. And so she was offended by that. And she said the idea sounds good, but why do we need him? And he's not doing anything anyway except selling us his book and making some money off of it. So she said to a friend of hers who was a minister there in town, and who had at one point worked as an agent for this white guy, how did he go about getting this congressman to introduce that bill? How do you get a congressman to introduce something? And what do people do? How do they do this? And he explained to her about lobbying and all that kind of stuff. And how do you organize and all that? And so he said, well, here's how he did it. I don't know if that's the way to do it. She said, well, I'm going to start something. We can do it. We don't need him. So what they did is they started out in the churches right in Murfreesboro. They went to church, and they went around to churches and talked to people. And they started in the Primitive Baptist church. A Primitive Baptist, by that it means that came out of the slave church. So you sang songs without any kind of accompaniment, and they wash each other's feet as Jesus did with the disciples. It's called Primitive Baptist. I happen to be a Primitive Baptist. But anyway, the Baptist church, and she talked to people, and people were very interested. And she said, we are going to get Congress to pass us something. And then she always talked about the Constitution, because she went to the primary school grades in the schools that had been set up by the Freedmen's Bureau there in town. And she knew about the Constitution. So she said, in the Constitution, there's a thing about petitioning your government. She meant petitioning your government. And we're going to petition the government and get the government to do this for us. And so, but then she had another idea. She said, instead of just doing that, first we'll get everybody's name on here who's been a slave. And if they can't write, somebody else can write it for them. And we're going to put down the name and who owns you. and how old you are and where you were owned. And we're going to send all of those things up there to Congress and ask them to give you a pension. And then if they don't give it to you, someday they will give it somehow, and your name will be up there. And so we want to get your names. And then the next thing we want to do is set up chapters all around wherever black people are, Negroes are, so that we can work to help each other. She said, because working together to help each other will keep us together. She said the hardest thing is going to be trying to keep us together. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our few little pennies and put them together, and when somebody's sick, we're going to get them a doctor if they need it, or take care of them. If somebody dies, we're going to bury them because they didn't have insurance. Immigrant groups did something similar at the same period of time. And she said, and if somebody is a widow, an orphan, we're going to take care of them. And that'll keep us together, and we'll have chapter meetings. And so she traveled through the churches, and then it worked. The people there all loved the idea. People signed up for the thing and paid their 5 cents dues and all the rest of it. If they didn't have 5 cents, they paid a penny or whatever they had, or promised to pay it at a later time. So she then decided to move to Nashville, because Nashville has transportation in and out, trains and everything. And Murfreesboro is kind of hard to go anywhere. And so her brother and his wife moved with her and her children, and they moved next door to each other. And the children by then, some of them were teenagers, and the smaller ones, the other ones could help with. And the brother and the wife took in a laundry too, helped her with the kids. She started traveling all around, all over the South, going to churches. She got a charter of the organization, which I found, which was done by the Primitive Baptist ministers in Nashville with their name on it, to set up this thing. So it grew out of the Baptist church, and they were the charter members. And she went everywhere, signing up people and talking to people and telling them about the Constitution. She just loved it. Was like Barbara Jordan talking about the Constitution. My faith in the Constitution is whole. We can tition. Let's go tition. And it just grew like wildfire. And the federal government got very concerned. This was in 1897. They had their first big national convention in Nashville in 1898. And the federal government got concerned. Malcolm X used to say that if a whole lot of black people get together and start doing something and white people don't know what they're doing, they get scared. So they said, what are these people doing? They keep going to these churches, having these meetings, and they all come out singing and feeling good about themselves. What in the world are they doing here in these little towns and hamlets all over? So they sent out inspectors to go to the meetings to spy on them to see what they were doing, or to come outside and look to see what they were doing and report back. And I found some of these reports. And they said, well, we couldn't see them doing anything except they would meet and they would sing. And then they would take notes of who gave money and who was renting, and then the building, the money collected to rent the space, the basement where they were having the meeting. And then they would talk about how somebody can't pay their money, and then they'd talk about how many people they had to bury and who was sick and all that. And that's all they did. And then they would sign up people and ask people, how many petitions have you had signed? They said, we don't see what they're doing. It's wrong. So that disturbed the bosses. The bosses said, look, you got to find something that they're doing, because this is dangerous. They've got at least 300,000 members. We have counted in their chapters, there are at least 300,000 people who signed up to this thing. That's a lot of people. So they said, how can we stop them? And this woman is in charge of it. Who told this woman she could be in charge of anything? So they said, we have the postal laws that keep certain things from being sent through the mails. The Comstock laws, the fraud laws, the laws that kept lotteries out of the mails, that kept birth control devices out of the mails. They said, if these people have something that is somehow sinful or illegal in some way that we can think of, we can keep it out of the mails, and they won't be able to communicate, and then they won't have a movement. So they said they engaged in fraud. Now, here's what the fraud was. The fraud was they're trying to get the government to do something that they know the government's not going to do. And that's fraud. They have organized a group and are collecting dues and paying for things and doing stuff, and she's collecting money from them under the pretense that they're going to get the government to do something, and the government's never going to do it. So that's fraud. So they sent a letter to her. while she was down in New Orleans, at the New Orleans chapter, she got it, saying, there's an order issued, you will never be able to send anything through the mails or receive anything through the mails, and the organization can, and none of the officers can, period. She was so mad because she didn't know why they were doing it. She was mad anyway, and she wrote a letter. Instead of just sitting and crying, she wrote a letter. I have 2 of her letters. She wrote a letter to the guy who was in charge that had sent the thing, and it started out with, have you read the Constitution? And she told him off in every way possible and said, all we're trying to do is get ourselves together, and y'all freed us, and now the man who had the right to work us to death has the right to starve us to death. And you got these old people who are decrepit, who are 80 and plus years old, who can hardly move from all the manual labor. You got all these people who were supposed to get pensions, who were in the service, and they won't give them to them, talking about they don't have documentation. You got people who are widows, and they won't give it to them, talking about they don't have documentation. We are just asking you to help us. And so what is wrong with that, and why are you bothering us? Of course, all they said back, they didn't say anything to her in the notes. This woman is defiant. She thinks Negroes can do whatever they wish to do. We will show her. Postmasters were ordered not to let any mail go to anybody or come. And several of the postmasters, there's one in particular I talk about in the book, said that any mail that came to his post office that was for any black person in the community, he just wouldn't give it to them. Because he figured it might have something inside about this organization. And therefore, if he just didn't give it to them, then they wouldn't be able to operate. So what does she have to do? She said, I'm not giving up. These chapters are running. I need to go around and see people. They had agents all over the country. They had chapter heads. They had them not just in the South, Kansas, Oklahoma, here in Massachusetts. They had them everywhere. Anywhere there was any black person, that was a chapter. New York City, everywhere. And she said, I'll just travel more. And we'll use the Railway Express, which was more expensive, which means that the expenses got to be really, really, really enormous. But it kept going. And the government kept them under surveillance. They kept sending petitions. They hired a lawyer in Washington to lobby for them, because everybody else had a lawyer lobbying for them. And the lawyer got 5 bills introduced into Congress to give the pensions. $12 a month if you're over 80, $4 if you're under 50. And the bills didn't get out of committee, but the reason why we have the petitions today that we can look at is because they were sent there, and then the committee sent them to the National Archives, which is where I found the petitions, and I have some of them in there. I also found the records of some of the chapters, and I talk about 2 of the chapters in the book, because the federal government said, oh, this organization is just a sham. They don't have any chapters, they don't have anything. Yet they did have chapters, and they in fact had in the government files some of the ledgers that they got from some of the chapters, and they kept saying they didn't have any chapters. So when they kept after them, Callie House decided that maybe we'll reorganize and try to deal with whatever the problem is the government thinks. We'll take all of our books and everything, give it to them, and maybe they'll leave us alone. So she hired a lawyer, a white lawyer, who had experience with these matters, and he went down to represent them and said, we'll tell you anything you want to know. Do you want to know how many people we buried? Do you want to know what chapters buried them? Here are the chapters. You can get in touch with these people. They didn't do any of that. They just wrote in their notes. What do they think they are doing, hiring another lawyer? Who are these people? So then she said, by 1912, this is going nowhere. We're not getting anything passed. The chapters were thriving, though. The mutual assistance stuff, the self-help was really going, and it did keep the people together. She was right about that. And they had more and more names signed to these petitions, but they couldn't get the legislation passed. She hired a lawyer to bring a suit in court. And she hired one of 2 black lawyers who was very well known nationally, and he was very well known by the national black bourgeoisie, and 2 of them had argued cases before the Supreme Court routinely, and he was one of them, a guy named Cornelius Jones. He said, I'll take the case. I don't know if I can win. I think the odds are against us, but if you want to take this case, I'll do it. And he took the case, and it went all the way up to the Supreme Court. They lost on the grounds that the government can't be sued unless the government permits itself to be sued, which is called sovereign immunity. But he took the case, and Callie House's view was, we need to try anything, everything that comes to hand, like Malcolm said. She didn't say like Malcolm said, I said that. But everything that comes to hand. We've been petitioning the government. Now we can sue and see if we can, maybe we won't win, but at least the people can see that there's movement and that we're trying to do something. And what she do? She found out before they sued that there was some cotton tax money that was in the federal treasury. She read about it in the paper. And she took the article to Cornelius Jones and said, look at this. They said that there's this money that's been there since the Civil War, the Confederates, and it's a specific amount of money, millions of dollars. Why don't we ask for that money? Because we picked the cotton, and so we ought to tell them to give us that money. So when he wrote a letter to the Treasury and asked them if the money was still there before he sued, and they said yes. So then he sued. And then after he sued, the Secretary of the Treasury had a press conference and said, there's no money there from, I don't know what this man is talking about. And the case went forward. And then when they lost the case at the Supreme Court, the same people in the Pension Bureau and the Post Office Department tried to put him in jail, Cornelius Jones, for being willing to be their lawyer to bring this suit, and said he was engaged in fraud because he was encouraging them to believe that there was some way for the government to do something. And they tried, and they couldn't put him in jail. They couldn't figure out. Many of the lawyers at the bar who knew him, and all these people, judges, and everybody came and testified and said, this is ridiculous, and he's got a case before the Supreme Court. You can't do this. But Callie House was a nobody, okay? A poor woman who was not a distinguished lawyer or anything like that. And she was leading a movement that was across gender lines. There were men and women in this movement. There were women at that time that led movements, black women, involving women, whether it was laundry women who went on strike in Atlanta or the club women. These were women's organizations. But here you got a woman who's leading an organization with 300,000 members, according to the government, which means they probably had more. And at a time, and there she is, this poor black woman, and she's nobody. She's not anybody. The black middle class leaders didn't come to her defense ever. She tried to get them to help. They said, why are you doing this? This is a distraction. We need to be working on voting rights and on education bills that they were trying to get through the Congress, the three remaining black leaders who were still in Congress. And she said to them, I don't understand. You've been trying to get those bills passed and they haven't passed. Why can't you help me to try to do this? I'm not saying you have to stop doing that. And they said, no, what you're doing is just a distraction. And Booker T. Washington said, you're just going to make white people mad, so you shouldn't do this. And so Booker T. Washington did a lot of good things, but his attitude was, she was right, she did make white people mad. So he was right about that. But she kept on doing it anyway. So finally then, they decided the movement is still growing. They had inspectors and people keeping her under surveillance and following her, and they decided to prosecute her directly. So they prosecuted her in 1917 for using the mails to defraud, and convicted her in the district court in Nashville, all-white male jury. Women didn't serve on those juries. And she went to jail in Jefferson City, Missouri. They sent women to prisons in the states then. There was no federal women's prison. And she served her time, a little over a year, in that prison. And the interesting thing about the prison was that she left no diary or anything like that, but Emma Goldman was in prison with her. And Emma Goldman wrote this great thing about prison life and what she was doing in the prison. And what they did, and Emma Goldman, and those of you who know about her, Emma Goldman was really a seamstress. That's what she was before she became an activist, and so was Callie. And what they had them doing in the prison was sewing uniforms and clothes for clothing manufacturers. So I was able to get a really good picture of what the prison life was like based on what Goldman reported and some articles and stuff about the prisons. And then the warden of the prison was very kind in giving me pictures of what the prison was like and what their cells were like and all the rest of it, which I put in the book. So that she served her time. She came out of prison, and but her trial, it was really pathetic. It was not reported in the reports, but it was reported in the white newspapers that wrote about this all the time to make fun of them. They wrote about this. They reported that black people were outside the courthouse crying and moaning and saying, she kept it alive, she kept it alive. And they didn't know what was going to happen now that she was being put in jail. And while she was in jail, the petition phase of the movement ended, but the chapters didn't. when she got out, the chapters were still going. I found chapters later. I've got a picture of some people in the Atlanta chapter in 1935. And the legacy of Callie House continued. She went back home to Nashville, and she lived in a poor, neighborhood where I lived as a baby. Shotgun house. She never had any money. The government claimed she was making money or something. She never had any. Her children never had any. They were all laborers and working class types. And she got uterine cancer and she died. And the legacy, though, is her movement. The agents in her movement, the chapters, went into the Garvey movement. When Marcus Garvey came to the States, the same people, the same names of people in these little towns and all around who were in her movement became Garveyites. And in the New Orleans chapter, there was a remarkable woman in the Garvey movement who came out of that, whose name was Audrey Moore. And Audrey Moore, who later is called Queen Mother Moore, became the heart and soul of the reparations movement after that time. And passed that all the way through the Muslims, all the way up through Malcolm, who all supported reparations, all the way through the people who are in Cobra, all the way through the people who are reparationists today. They can trace the history of the people who are involved. And some of the people who live in places like Louisiana, who you see in the flood and all the stuff that's happening down, some of those black people who've been down there forever, some of them, their ancestors were in the ex-slave pension movement chapter all over Louisiana at that time. Of course, they never got what they, asked for. So the legacy of this woman lives on, and she thought that if they got this money, it would empower the people. They'd have more to do what they needed to do. And she said, when the government was taking her to jail, she said, I gave my heart and soul to this movement, and I'm willing to sacrifice, and I'm willing to die for it. And that's the story of Callie House and the ex-slave pension movement. Thank you very much. Should I let anyone ask questions, or what should I do?
How about now? Okay. I'm going to just ask that people ask it into the microphone so everyone can hear. So,
does anybody have a question?
I'll be running the mic around.
Or a comment, or if you just ever wanted to get up before an audience and testify to something, you can do that. If not, then no.
Thank you for that story. It was great. I wanted to know how you came to the title of the novel. What made you decide?
Where does the title come from?
Yeah.
One of the letters she wrote to the government when they cut off their money, they're using the mails and stuff, and said they were engaged in fraud. She didn't know why they were doing it, because she doesn't know what I know, because she didn't read the government files. And she was puzzled. And so she wrote this letter when she got that, and she said, I can't figure out why you're bothering us. All we are is a bunch of poor people trying to petition the government. And she said, my face is black, it's true. But I believe in honesty and in dealing with my fellow man, and I believe in the Constitution. And so the title of the book came from her letter.
In what way did her work or her lawsuits intersect with the early NAACP?
The early NAACP?
Yeah.
The NAACP, the first case that they were involved in, although they were not parties in council of record, was the grandfather clause case in Oklahoma, which was 1915. So in terms of timing, there was that overlap in terms of the lawsuit. But the people, by and large, who were in the NAACP felt like the other middle-class black leaders that her work, what they were doing was a distraction and was going to irritate people. And talking about reparations does irritate people, so they were right about that, yes. But there is that overlap in terms of time. And the important thing, one of the important things about this movement from the standpoint of those of us who do history, is that there's this gap in the history of the period about what was happening in the country and what was happening to African Americans. This is like a missing part of our history. We know about lynching, and we know about sharecropping, and we know about Jim Crow. But we don't know that all of these people saw another way of doing something. And as Dr. Dorothy Hyatt, president of the National Council of Negro Women, said to me when I told her about this and she got the book and read it, she said, I feel like somebody kept part of my history from me. I didn't even know about this woman. And here she is, and she's my hero.
I have a question actually to follow up on that, which is why? Why did we not know about this woman? How did this enormously important part of history and this enormously heroic woman get forgotten by history?
Well, it's harder to do history of people who leave no diaries or no. We for years talked about what do you do about people who are not those who are literate and who have a lot of photographs of everybody in their family. When I tell people that I don't have any pictures of even my grandparents, they don't believe me. And only about 2 pictures of myself when I was little. And that most people in my family don't, because we didn't have any money to get any pictures. So Callie House didn't keep a diary. Callie House didn't write letters and organize her correspondence so that she didn't think she was a person that history would be interested in the first place. It never even occurred to her. And nobody who was involved with her thought of that. And as a matter of fact, if the government hadn't gone after them and therefore created all these records for the purpose of harassing them, I wouldn't have had, first, this great body of evidence which I could use. And one of the reasons why I was able to do that is not just because I do history, but I also am a lawyer. And so I knew what sources to look at and what kinds of things and what to do with them. But if they hadn't created these, and if her letters hadn't been in those files, then I wouldn't have been able to find them and then piece together. And it's hard detective work, I have to tell you, to piece together the lives of history from the bottom up when you're looking at people who are, and those people who kept those ledgers, if they hadn't written these nice little ledgers in their little handwriting, and then they put it in these files for the purpose of prosecuting, they put it in there to show she was the leader of the organization. They even told the court that they had no chapters, which was a lie. They had the ledgers right there in their files with the painstaking records of financial and everything else that had gone on. So it's easy to overlook people. It's hard to dig out stuff on folks but I don't know why, even though this article was written that I wrote years ago in this journal, some people have talked about Callie House from that article and mentioned it. All they knew about it was that. But I don't know why no one, well, let's put it this way. For years in the African American community, we like to write about the history of people who we thought were what Du Bois would call part of the talented tenth. Well-educated, respectable people. Callie House was not respectable. She was a troublemaker. She was a woman who left her children in the care of her brother and his wife and themselves while she went around the country having a movement, and she wasn't afraid. She didn't care what anybody said about her or what anybody did. She traveled by herself and would go places and do all kinds of things, anything to keep the movement going. She was just, that wasn't the kind of respectability that anybody was interested in talking about. As for why younger historians haven't looked into her, there are other topics where there's more materials you can get, easier to put things together. And so maybe they just never thought of it. Or maybe they thought that she was just a crook based on the fact that the government prosecuted her. So why do a story about a crook, Don't know the answer. Yes.
I'm sorry. Did her movement intersect with the women's movement at that time? I mean, I sort of... Oh, I can't. Did her movement intersect with the women's movement? I'm sort of like following up on Jacqueline's statement. I'm so surprised that she's missed. It's like I've realized that there isn't a body of material about her, but in certain movements you would think that if she intersect, people would know of her.
Well, in the women's movement, they knew about the club women who marched with them and did stuff, and people have written about that. But Callie House didn't do any of that. I mean, she wasn't in the women's suffrage movement. She didn't really say anything about that except that her faith in the Constitution was whole, and she believed that people had the right to be represented and so on. And if she'd been asked, I think she would have said, yeah, they need to vote and whatever else they need to do. But her activity was in a whole area that folks were not in. And it was a poor people's movement. Reparations have always been a poor people's movement. You know, today it's not about people who are alive and were slaves. Like she was talking about people who were alive and were slaves. There were 1.3 million in the 1900 who had been slaves who were still alive, but they were dying very, very, very rapidly, and many of them soon died out. Anybody have anything else? Yes.
This is so fascinating, this recovered history that you're bringing us. It seems as if there are two themes in Callie House's work, the reparations theme and the mutual aid theme. Can you talk a little bit about the origins of that practice of pooling money for the sake of a moment when one member of the pool needs it?
Mm-hmm. Could I talk about that?
Yes, if you could talk about the origins of it.
Oh, the origins of it.
Yeah.
At the time that she was doing this, as I said, immigrant groups that came to the United States in successive waves of European immigrants would do the same thing. The idea was that, and in the black community, there were lots of people who believed in mutual assistance because the insurance companies would not insure black people. Most of them would not. There were all kinds of things that had been written at the time saying that blacks were going to die out as a people. As strange it may seem to us, there were people who wrote serious articles that since blacks weren't slaves anymore and weren't taken care of, that they would die out as a people because they couldn't take care of themselves. And so no insurer wanted to insure them, which is why black insurance companies started. And also people didn't have health insurance of any kind, and they didn't have life insurance. And so the idea of poor people coming together to put their money together, and there were other groups that did mutual assistance. Some churches did it and the like. But her idea of having these particular people who were so poor do this as a major function of their chapters, along with the signing petitions, was a stroke of genius because she was right. It did keep them together because they could see something tangible happening. Even while they weren't getting the pensions, at least they were helping each other to do something. It was very, and the things that are in these ledgers make you cry. There was this woman, you know, at the Columbia, Missouri chapter meeting. The oldest member there was 101 years old, and she was still working because she didn't have money. She was working. And Creasy Mack, who was 89 years old, still worked in the same house that she had worked in. She had worked for this owner as a slave. And then when she was freed, she continued to work, and they let her do household work. As she got older, and she could hardly move around. But these people were still working, even though they were that age, and they wanted to have something to bury people and and they patterned it after mutual assistance, and it was a stroke of genius for this movement. And Vaughn, who was the white guy who was doing all this, he never thought of that. He was just trying to sell his pamphlet and do whatever he was doing. Okay, all right. Yes, one more, I guess, back there.
Hi, I'm just wondering what you see as the linkage between what Callie House and the people she was working with were asking for in the modern reparations movement.
What link do I see?
Yeah, in terms of what's being asked for, in terms of the thinking about the justification today versus what it was then.
Yeah.
That kind of.
Well, I discuss in the book, I bring the story up to the modern reparations movement and trace not only the organizations but the ideas and theories that are around now and how they relate to what those folks were arguing back then. Today we have some people who are arguing for litigation, which Ogletree, somebody mentioned Tree earlier. Tree and some other lawyers have been trying to bring these lawsuits, and so far they haven't been successful. Deidre Paulman has been bringing these, going to companies and trying to get companies to pay some kind of reparations, like a fund or something, and apologize. And some of them have apologized, and some have set up scholarships and the like to try to help people in general. The difference, of course, is that today they're talking about people who hadn't, and not actual people who had been slaves, except in one instance that I know about, and that guy has now died. They're talking about descendants of people. And many people argue, people who are against reparations, that since you're not talking about people who actually were slaves, then you shouldn't do it. And a lot of the arguments are based on the argument for reparations to Japanese Americans after World War II, which didn't get done in the courts, although they brought lawsuits, because lawsuits educate people too. Whether you win or lose, they educate people. And in the case of Japanese Americans, they so educated the public, even though they lost, that they were able to get a commission to investigate, and then they were able to get legislation. Now, John Conyers has had a bill in the Congress for years now trying to get a commission to study the idea, and he can't even get that passed. Conyers, by the way, got into this by way of Detroit is very key to all this, because in Detroit, this old black man that I told you about, who told the labor union activists started with some other people a chapter to talk about reparations in Detroit. And the labor union activists passed a torch to a guy who they call Reparations Ray in Detroit. And John Conyers' brother was involved in the labor movement, and Conyers comes out of that group. And so there's a whole big group of people in Detroit, which is why Conyers is very attuned to this history. The people in Chicago who have had the resolution passed to have companies say whether or not they were implicit, some of them are descendants of people who were in the reparations, so that everything is connected to everything else. It's very interesting. The modern case for reparations, you could argue that if people who were actually slaves couldn't get anything, couldn't even get a measly $12 for people over 80 years old, how do you expect people who are not slaves and who are just descendants to get it? I think there should be a lawsuit brought in the names of those people who sued in 1915, because the people in 1915 did not wait too late. You can't say that their claims are limited by time because they sued in 1915. They just lost. There's no reason why their descendants can't bring some kind of lawsuit in their names. I also think that descendants of those people who are on the rolls ought to reclaim their ancestors and find their names and give praise and honor to them for what they were willing to courageously do. You have to remember that in the late 19th century, historian Rayford Logan called that the lowest point on the long, rugged trail that blacks had gone since emancipation. Lynching was rife. There was so much backlash. We talk about backlash. Yet these people were courageous enough to go to these little meetings in the churches and to talk to each other and gather together and go around talking about the Constitution and looking proud and trying to do something for each other and signing these petitions to send them to Congress. And this woman was willing to do this, and all these people, and they've got descendants walking around this country right now who don't even know who they are and don't even bother to. And I'm hoping they'll find out, because Callie House's descendants are ashamed of her because they think she was just some woman who was a jailbird. And so they need to read this book, and I'm going to have them read it. Yeah. Okay, and then we're through here.
It just made me think about this question that it made me think of this question that if the court is resistant to paying reparations to descendants of slaves, how do they justify not paying reparations to those of the Tulsa, Oklahoma riots? Because many of them are still alive.
Well, Ogletree, in the case that they brought, what the judge told him that the time had passed, too much time had passed, and the statute of limitations had run, and they didn't claim their rights in time. And Tree and the rest of the lawyers argued that they didn't because they were scared because of all the people who were getting killed. But that's how they lost. And I'm saying that the folks I'm talking about didn't sleep on their rights. They sued in 1915. So if it was any possibility of them going back and saying the law was wrongly decided, there might be something. But I don't have any, if you want to know the truth, I don't have any fond hope that that's going to happen. I think the reparations question and discussing it is very important because it ought to be discussed, because it gets us to discuss our history and where we are today and how all this stuff, happens to people. So I think it's an important question. Some people say a full-throated apology for slavery would be enough. But, that's not even forthcoming. We apologize for other things. So I don't know the answer to that. But I just think that it's important. I also think this discussion about Callie House, finally, is very important for people who do women's history and talk about what women were doing throughout history. it adds a new dimension to what was going on in this period between the 1890s and 1917, and she's in the pantheon of women who made these kinds of steps despite gender bias and everything else that she had to face that took place in that period. And thank you very much for coming.